Hello everyone, welcome to our first very brief discussion of what a literary insight paper looks like. In other words, what are the essays going to look like in this course? This is just a very brief introduction and we're going to spend first part of the term going over all of this in detail, but here's a quick look. Just a reminder please not to distribute any of these materials beyond the course. Thank you. These are the 10 components that we'll be discussing in detail that go into your essays. We call them literary insight papers because you're writing about literature. There are 4 components in an introduction. Author, title, abstract topic, evidence preview, link to theme, and thesis statement. Those are the only 4 things we ever want to see in an introduction. Quite often students write, sometimes the introductions are the best part of their essay if they're not using a template because they spend all their time on an introduction and then the essay falls apart because they got half an hour left to write the essay. So our introductions are very brief. They only have these 4 components. You can see they're 2, 3, 4 sentences long and that's it. That's all we want. Body paragraphs have claim, evidence, and analysis. And summaries have, conclusions have a summary, an acknowledgement of limitation, and a suggestion for further study. Those are the 10 components that you have to use in the essays in this course and what we're going to talk about very briefly now and go into great detail for the first segment of this course. Now I'm going to tell you the specific job of each of these 10 components, and this is all taken from your Paul Hedrick textbook, A Method for Writing Essays About Literature. And I'm going to use some examples of these. I'm going to take component 1 and give you an example from an essay written about a story called The Guest by Albert Camus. So we're going to look at the 10 components briefly, and they would be taken from an essay that uses the 10 components, and the essay is about a story called The Guest. So I'm assuming you've downloaded the handout, what a literary insight essay looks like. And if you look at the first component, it says author, title, abstract topic. And the job of this opening component is to tell the reader what your thesis statement's about. So if your first sentence is Albert Camus' philosophically complex story, The Guest, is about individual freedom and personal attachments, now I know what your thesis statement will be about. Individual freedom and personal attachments. An abstract topic. Abstract simply means something you cannot visualize. If I say pen, you can visualize a pen. Or if I say desk, you can visualize that. Those are concrete topics. But an abstract topic is something like freedom or personal attachments. We know what they are, but we can't visualize them. So the first sentence of an essay always gives the author of the story or the novel or the play, and then the title of the story or novel or play, and then the topic that your thesis statement will be about. That's its job. Then we have what's called an evidence preview. And this is sort of where you briefly touch on what your quotations will be about in your body paragraphs. Evidence just means what you quote or what you paraphrase in the body paragraphs. So an evidence preview is usually just briefly tells us what the quotations will be about so that when we get to your body paragraphs, we're not surprised or confused by your quotations. We think, oh yeah, that was mentioned in the introduction. So for example, through the main character's geographic circumstances, his conflicting emotions as he eats with the prisoner's decision to turn himself in despite the consequences for Deroux, and Deroux's new perspective on the landscape at the story's resolution, you'll notice that's not a full sentence. But now I know that in the first body paragraph, the quotations will be about Deroux. Deroux is the main character, the protagonist. It will be about his geographic circumstances. There's actually an essay in your textbook on page 93, and if you look at the first body paragraph, that's what the quotations are about, the geographical surroundings around him, where he lives. And then if you go to the second body paragraph, the quotations are about how he's conflicted as he eats with the prisoner. I'm assuming you've read this story already, but if not, you should quickly read the story. Just pause here and do that. And this is what's called an evidence preview, and you briefly touch upon what the quotations are about so that we're not surprised. That's the job of an evidence preview. The third component of an introduction is the second half of the sentence. So through A, B, and C, D, through A, B, C, and D, the story makes an important commentary on the limitations of freedom, or the story raises an important theme. You're just saying that, look, through these quotations, the story raises an important theme. You could even write the story raises an important theme, or the novel raises an important theme, or the play raises an important theme. You could do that on every essay, and the component would be 100% correct. And the job of this component is just to tell us, look, through the quotations that I'm going to quote in my body paragraphs, if you understand them, you will understand the theme of the text. And then the thesis statement tells us the theme of the text. Ultimately, the guest insists that although individuals might conceive of themselves as free, they're inescapably connected to the people around them and must accept and foster these attachments. So if you explain those quotations you just paraphrased briefly, if you explain them carefully in your body paragraphs, we will believe this is the theme of the text. So that's the job of the thesis, to tell us the theme of the text. So that's your introduction. It's very brief, 2, 3, 4 sentences long. Usually the evidence preview and the link to theme are in one sentence. Then you move on to a body paragraphs. Now, in our essays, you'll have 3 body paragraphs. In your research paper, it'll be a little, maybe 4 or 5, but they all have the same structure. The first thing they have is what's called a claim. And a claim, the job is simply to tell us what the quotation below it or after it means. That's it. So don't write a topic sentence about a character in general or a general topic. The only job of a claim ever is to tell us what the quotation after it means. You have to ignore the rest of the novel or the play or the story. The claim only tells us what the evidence in that paragraph means. So, for example, Daru's physical surroundings create an impression of unlimited freedom and detachment. If that's the claim of the first body paragraph, I know that any quotation in that body paragraph is going to be about his physical surroundings, and you're going to explain how they're significant or how they're symbolic. Daru's interaction during his meal with the prisoner and decision to set the man free suggests that he's experiencing a conflict between individual freedom and attachment. Okay, so now I know the quotation after this, the evidence, is going to be about their interaction when they're eating. And that's it. You're not going to cover any other part of the story in this paragraph. Only, the job of a body paragraph is simply to explain the piece of evidence there. And then through the prisoner's decision to turn himself in and his family's threat to Daru, the story suggests that personal attachments are powerful and inescapable. So now I know that if you look at this final claim here, the prisoner's decision to turn himself in, there'll be a quote about that, and then there'll be another quote about the family's threat to Daru. Now I know what the quotations are about. You've briefly told me what they mean, and you're going to follow this with those quotations. Now, after your claim, of course, you provide the evidence. The claim tells us what the evidence means, and then you immediately give us the evidence. Before Daru and the prisoner go to sleep, the prisoner asks Daru if he will be accompanying him to Tingwit. When Daru says he doesn't know, the prisoner says, "Come with us." Okay, so the evidence is just the quotation that you're going to explain in your paragraph. In these essays, everything comes down to the evidence that you choose to discuss. You got to choose quotations that are not obvious, that to the average reader would seem difficult to understand. It might not be difficult for you because we're doing our online discussions together, but imagine if you gave a novel like Deliverance to your friend to read, and you pointed out a line in the novel. She or he might not grasp its full meaning because she or he hasn't studied the novel or listened to anyone else talk about it or that kind of thing. So the key to writing great essays is to choose pieces of evidence, quotations, that are really difficult to understand. That makes for an interesting paper because you're going to teach us something new that we didn't understand before. Now, the way you do this when you write your analysis. The job of the analysis is to explain the evidence and claim. Okay, so you give a claim that tells us what the evidence means, then you quote the evidence, and because this evidence is difficult to understand, we might not understand that claim yet. But in your analysis, which is always 6 or 7 sentences, it's the bulk of your paragraph, you're going to explain the claim and the evidence. So the job of the analysis is to explain the claim and the evidence. The claim tells us what the evidence means, then we give the evidence, and then the analysis explains what the claim and evidence mean in greater detail. So that's what you do in your body paragraphs. Now you move on to your conclusion. And the summary is just, you just briefly reiterate the main points of your argument. In high school, this would be your whole conclusion. And it's usually 2 to 4 sentences in length. So you're just summing up your main points. But we add a couple other components. First of all, we add what's called an acknowledgement of limitation. We write, this essay is limited in scope, or a further study might analyze the story and blah, blah, blah. Somehow you've got to acknowledge that your essay doesn't cover all the bases. You have to write that down and let your reader know you're aware of that. Otherwise, we could kind of look ignorant, as if we're not aware that there are other ways to interpret the novel or the play. We have to let our reader know we're aware of that. We've looked at them.